The last element of the classical that I want to discuss with you is the Acropolis. And we spoke before about how the Acropolis basically just means high city, and how each of the Greek city-states would have one. Of course, the most famous is the Athenian Acropolis, where we're going to spend our time now. And it is a place, of course, to honor the gods, where their temples would be constructed. And there's also some other buildings up here that honor significant events in Athenian history. We're not really going to have time to cover those, but I gave you some things in the modules to look at. And again, you can always go online and look a little further into like the Erechtheion, the Temple of Athena Nike, and some of the other buildings that are quite interesting. But again, for our purposes, take up a little bit too much time. So again, go down that rabbit hole if you want to. Do more research. It's always a lot of fun. I mentioned that Pericles, the statesman, would have some impact on the events here in Athens, and he figures most prominently in the Acropolis project. During the attack by the Persians, the Acropolis was extremely damaged and destroyed, mainly. Some things were saved, but not many. The original Athena cult statue, for instance, is one of the things that was saved. Some of the sculptures and the offerings and such were buried, like the Peplos Chore, but there was immense amount of damage done here. And this is their holy site. So if you think about this, this is very damaging to the Athenian psyche, their mentality. They would have felt it like an open wound. It would have been very, very hard on them as a people. So one of the things that Pericles actually lobbies for is trying to restore the Acropolis and restore the buildings and restore the glory of Athens in a sense. And again, we'll get more to that in a minute. Now, how does this segue with the Delian League that you're seeing here also on the slide? So after the Persians attack the Greek city-states, they start to talk about how, hey, maybe we should all try to protect each other a little bit more. Maybe we should try to come together, right, as Greeks rather than be so separate based on our city-states. So they decide to come together in what they call the Delian League. They name it that because they're going to base their treasury, where they kept their money, on the island of Delos. You can go back to a map of the Cycladic island chain, and you'll see Delos is one of the islands out in the Aegean Sea. We believe that they picked the island of Delos for their treasury, in a sense their headquarters, because it seemed like neutral territory, right? It was hard to get to, from the mainland. It took some time. So it was a way of trying to have some neutrality about where you kept your money. The Delian League comes from the island of Delos. And this is something that the Greek city-states, they try. They want to try to be unified. They think if they're unified, they will be able to keep threats like the Persians away from them. However, we know how this goes with the Greeks. They're not very good at being unified. So Pericles actually lobbies the other Athenians to take money from the Delian League's treasury, just a loan, we might say, right? And he'll pay it back, to rebuild the Acropolis. Obviously, when the other city-states find out about this, it's going to be a problem. But in the time that he pitches this, it sounds like a fabulous idea to the other Athenians. He pitches it as patriotism and pride, city-state pride, right? And a necessary thing to rebuild their Acropolis. Again, it's really stolen money. So, if you think about his motivations, sure, they're admirable, but he's basically taking, an interest-free loan without even the approval of the bank and building this project from that. And I always joke that if we're getting money from somebody else, we tend not to be very prudent in how we use it. We're very prudent about how we use our own money. We're very careful about that. We're like, I gotta save, that costs too much. Oh, I'm not gonna pay for shipping, right? I'll put all kinds of stuff in the cart, right? But $5 for shipping, you're crazy. We're very, very prudent with our own money. If somebody else is paying for something, we suddenly become big spenders, don't we? We're like, oh, normally I'd have the chicken, but I'll have the filet mignon tonight, right? At dessert, don't mind if I do. So that's my joke, is that when we're on somebody else's tab, we tend not to care so much about what we're spending. And that definitely was true for Pericles and the people that he hired to come do this project. For instance, he hires Phidias, who's considered one of the best architects and sculptors of his time, to be kind of the foreman or the person who controls the entire project. And Phidias then hired others to come in and do different parts of the project. These were people that were not cheap. They were going to cost you some money. And so again, it shows you the sort of scale that Pericles set in his mind for the rebuild of the Acropolis. Let me be clear, the original Acropolis was nothing like this. The original Acropolis was very basic and humble in comparison to what you see here. So Pericles was like, let's rebuild and let's do it even better than we did before, but we need to use this money that's not even ours. And by the way, their betrayal of the Delian League will actually lead to the Peloponnesian War, so there you go. You're looking at a diagram or a plan, right, of all the different buildings. As I mentioned, we're not going to have time to go through all of them. We're mainly going to focus on the Parthenon, which is number 8. So we're going to look at that primarily. Why look at this? Because it's a great example of classical architecture. Now, for the purposes of the class, I try to keep things very streamlined. We only have so much time. And instead of showing you a bunch of different temples, what I do is I try to pick out a very good example. And to me, the Parthenon is the best example of classical architecture you're going to see, and really the best example of Greek temple architecture in general. So I don't fixate a lot on architectural examples. I just try to show you a really good one, and the Parthenon is that. You'll note that there are 2 architects related to this building, Iktinos and Kallikrates, and they were the best of their time. So Phidias, again, hiring the best of the best. He was going to bring in the people that he knew could do this job and do it right. Now, a note on the name Parthenon. Why is it called that? It comes from the Greek word parthenos. So take the N off the end of the word and put an S on instead. So take the N off the end of the word, put an S on. Parthenos. Parthenos meant virgin. The goddess Athena, who this temple is dedicated to because we're in Athens, was a virgin goddess. So this is why it is called the Parthenon, because it's coming from the term parthenos and relates to the virgin status of Athena as goddess. If you know Athena's backstory, she is born from Zeus's forehead. She's never born from the womb of a woman, and so when we talk about this, we say, this idea that she's not born of a woman, and so she is not sexualized in any kind of way. We believe that's why she is a virgin goddess. So that's one of the theories about her status and why she is a virgin figure. She's the goddess of wisdom and warfare. So again, this is why it's called the Parthenon. We're going to look at the Pantheon as well. But again, if you understand language, you shouldn't get them confused. Because pan means all, theon means the gods. So pan, theon, all the gods. So when we get to Rome, we talk about the Pantheon. You shouldn't confuse it with the Parthenon, because you know what the words mean. But that is why the temple was named this. So as I mentioned, Iktinos and Kallikrates, they're very good at their craft. And they basically set up a very classical, logical structure. As I mentioned, classicism to me is all about perfection. It's about order. It's about rationality. It's about rules. It's about developing an idea of how to have either realism or naturalism in the sense of sculpture, or perfection, right, and logic in the case of architecture. So what they do is they start to think about what is a logical way to order a building. And they almost approach it like a math problem. Because here you have the plan of the Parthenon, and you'll notice that you have this almost math problem equation. If you took the length of the structure and divided it by 2, you'd get the width. If you took the width and times it by 2, you'd get the length. So everything is organized to be logical, make sense. You might have heard the golden mean, these kind of ideas. There's a front porch and a back porch, 2 entrances, so that has symmetry. It matches, it makes sense. So everything they did was about trying to create this idea of perfection, orderliness, and have everything have this kind of, this idea of making sense, right, or coming together in a logical type of way. In the interior space, you'll notice you have the treasury, which is to the left-hand side, and then the area for the goddess statue, which we call the cella, which was the interior part of the temple. As I mentioned that basically you don't enter these temples. You had a priest or a priestess who took your offerings into the temple for you, perhaps into the treasury if it was cash, right? So they did that work for you. You did not enter the temple. The animal sacrifices happened on the porch, everything happened on the exterior, and the priestesses are the ones who inhabited the inner sanctum, in a sense, of the temple. The temple is also really well known for its use of interesting planning as far as strategies that involve optical illusions, these kind of things that architects had to think up so the space would work correctly. For instance, here at the Parthenon, in order to make the columns look correct or straight, there's actually a little bulge in the middle of them. So as you go up the column, you'll notice the columns are actually made out of drums or individual sections. As you went up the column, the drums would actually get a little bit bigger. And so in a sense, they start to bulge a little bit in the middle. And then they would become smaller again. So the drums of the column, they'd be smaller, then bigger, then smaller as you went up the column. We call this in stasis. From far away, your column is going to look straight and correct because of that bulging that was put in there. So your eye is tricked in a sense. It's an optical illusion. If you didn't include that trick, your columns would look really funky. And this is why I always joke that Ictinos and Callicrates are really good, because they knew this stuff, right? Blows my mind. And then you'll notice that in the diagram here, the floor looks like it's sloped. And the floor of the Parthenon actually slopes up a little bit in the middle, and then back down again in order to make the floors actually look straight. So why invest in someone like Ictinos and Callicrates? Well, they knew how to do this stuff. They knew how to make sure your temple was designed correctly. Phidias designed the cult statue of Athena that was going to be present here at the Parthenon. As I mentioned before, the original cult statue was saved, but it was just a very small, life-size wooden statue. If you're borrowing somebody's money, you're going to want something amazing, right? So Phidias created this giant gold and ivory statue. Gold and ivory used together is called chryselephantine, if you want a very specific way of talking about this. Her skin, though, you'll notice is the ivory, the gold, right, used for the headdress and the clothing and such. So the gold and the ivory together. These are both very precious materials for the time. And the statue, some people estimate it was between 40 to 60 feet tall. Huge statue. And again, you have models here because obviously it does not exist any longer. Something made out of gold and ivory, yeah, that's long gone on this scale. And one of the things I wanted to mention is that, I don't like these models because they show people kind of in the temple, and I'm like, no, the only priestesses would have went in the temple. Those two guys on the left kind of hanging out and talking, yeah, they shouldn't be there, right? That's bad modeling. Because again, this was an inner sanctum that the priestesses would inhabit with the goddess. You wouldn't just be strolling in and doing things in the temple. You'll also notice that she's holding in her hand the Nike figure, spelled Nike, Nike, right? But it really is pronounced Nike. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Nike or the victory when we get to the Nike of Samothrace. So I'll explain a little bit more about that. But it is a symbol of victory. So this idea of the Athenians rising out of the ashes like a phoenix, right, from the Persians attacking them being victorious and rebuilding their culture, rebuilding themselves. But Phidias, of course, wanted to do the cult statue because let's face it, this is probably the most impressive thing that would have been seen at the Acropolis site. You also can look at the Parthenon, talk a bit about the sculpture that was created for it on the exterior. I had mentioned that mainly marble sculpture is seen on the outside of architectural buildings. This is because they could support the weight of marble statuary. If you were seeing sculpture made for personal use or people's homes, it was usually bronze. So here you're going to have marble sculpture. You'd have it on both entrances or porches in the area we call the pediment, which is that triangular area that's right above the columns. And that is where they would do their storytelling, like you see here with the birth of Athena. So you'd have a story on one side, a story on the other side. In the case of the Parthenon, you had the birth of Athena, and you also had on the other side the battle of Poseidon and Athena for Athens. Because if you know the mythology, Poseidon and Athena basically had a contest, right, for who would control Athens. And if you research the Erechtheion more, you find that there's there's a salt spring and an olive tree there that honor that story as well. So if you choose to look more at the Erechtheion, you'll find out more about that contest, right, by looking at that building. The Parthenon has been through a lot over the years. It started out as a Greek temple. It was converted to a Byzantine church. It was then converted to an Islamic mosque. And then it was used to store gunpowder by the Venetians when they were occupying Greece, and was blown up, essentially. So the roof was blown off. A lot of the sculpture was destroyed. For instance, the Poseidon and Athena battle scene, most of that is only fragmentary now because most of it was destroyed. So it's not always easy for us to look at these marbles, which is why I'm showing you a reconstruction here. And I'll show you some of the fragments as well that are in the British Museum here in a second, but this building has gone through a lot. Athens has a lot of acid rain issues, so a lot of the original sculpture has been removed and put in the Acropolis Museum. It's just a very worn building, right? It's been through quite a bit. But I like this diagram. It gives you a sense of how the pediment forces the use of space, right? So you can kind of get a sense of how that triangular area forced the narrative to be constructed. And it gives you a sense of this story. And as I mentioned, Athena is born from Zeus's forehead, and you can see that when you're looking at the diagram. Here's some of the pediment sculpture. This is in the British Museum in London. And this story links up with the figure of Lord Elgin. And we can talk a little bit about colonialism right through this story as well. Lord Elgin was in Greece during the time when the Venetians were occupying it, and basically made a deal with them to remove a lot of the Parthenon marbles and take them back to Britain. And the Venetians, of course, this wasn't their cultural patrimony, so they were like, yeah, sure, how much are you going to pay us? Bye, take the sculptures. And this is what happens a lot during what we deem, the Romantic period and the period of colonialism and the 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s. You have a lot of this removal of objects from their original location by European cultures. It's just classic colonialist behavior, and they show up here in the British Museum. Of course, if we're not happy about this happening, just know that Lord Elgin was basically bankrupted from the transportation costs, so he kind of got his, I guess, in the end. But today they're in the British Museum, and the British Museum has created a beautiful building for them and a beautiful room for them to be shown. So it's kind of hard as an art historian sometimes because, I don't think these things should be stolen from their original cultures. But at the same time, I know that the people taking care of them, people like me, art historians, archaeologists, we are very non-political about how we treat these objects. We just want them to be taken care of. So I know the British Museum has made a beautiful space for them. I've seen them in person, obviously. So it's kind of a hard topic for my people, I would say, what we call repatriation or returning things to their patrimony, right, the place that they came from. For a long, long time, the Greeks were asking for these back, and the British were like, no, that's fine. We're not going to give them back. They're perfectly fine here. We can take care of them. Don't worry about it. And about 2 or 3 years ago, actually, the British decided, okay, you can have them back. And they started the repatriation process. So I say, why I love art history is like never give up hope that people might change their mind about something. It happens all the time, more than you think, So the Greeks kept asking, and finally the British were like, you're right. This is your culture. This is your heritage. We should give this back to you and let you display it, let you handle it. And it was like, again, it's slow going if you actually look at the steps that have been taken, but it's something, and it's acknowledging, again, the true heritage of these pieces. So that's pretty exciting. You're looking here at some of the Metopes sculpture. And I always love showing you these because I want you to look at how they're high relief. And you could compare these to the Ashurbanipal relief sculptures I showed you to give a sense of the difference in high relief and low relief, right? So being able to compare the difference between the two. They both have backing elements, but obviously here it's very high relief, where it's almost detaching, from the backing in a sense. It's very, very high. Now, if you can't make it to Athens, right, you can always go to Nashville. They have a full-scale reproduction of the Parthenon. So again, if you can't make it right to Athens, you could always choose to go to Nashville and take it in there. Why was this built in Nashville? It was built for a World's Fair, and it was originally meant to be something that was temporary. And then the people really liked it, so they decided to make a permanent version. Again, everything full scale. There's a full scale Athena statue inside. That's a replica. It's pretty amazing. And Nashville often calls itself the Athens of the South because they have a lot of colleges and universities there. So again, it's kind of a connection they have with this idea of Athens and classical history and such. So if you can't get a ticket to Greece, right, you can always go here and see the Nashville reproduction. It'd be a lot of fun.